You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
I would like to give a shout out to my younger brother, Adam, who does not listen to this podcast, but nonetheless, happy birthday to my brother, Adam.
Does he refuse to listen to Mind Over Murder?
No, he just has no interest. He says, I don't want to listen to that murder stuff.
Okay, that murder stuff.
I don't want to listen to that murder stuff.
Even though it's his kid sister. That's okay.
I'm the older sister, excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought he was older.
Nope, I'm older by 3 years.
Oh, I thought with him being cranky and all that he was the older brother.
No, I'm the boss of him.
Oh, you are the boss of him. Thankfully, you're not the boss of me. In other true crime news, and on a much more serious note, we've been discussing the case of Gabrielle Petito, which has also highlighted a number of other unsolved murders in the western part of the United States, including a number of Native American and Indigenous women. There are hundreds of Native American and Indigenous women missing in that part of the country, as well as other cases which remain frustratingly unsolved. One of them is yet another lesbian couple who've been murdered in a national park, and their case remains unsolved. Another lesbian couple who were murdered in the same area, this was a married couple, two women, Kylan Carol Schulte, and Crystal Michelle Turner, age 38. They were last seen leaving a bar in Moab, Utah, same area, and they were found shot to death. And they had told friends they had run into a creepy guy, someone that made them uncomfortable, but not much more of a description than that. Moab, Utah, which is not far from the Arches National Park. These are beautiful areas with not a lot of crime. The whole thing just seems very mysterious. I'm not trying to link Gabby Petito's disappearance and the murder of Kylan and Crystal. I don't think these things are related, but certainly you need to explore all of the potential avenues. I'm hopeful that with additional resources put into both of these cases that we'll see some sort of resolution. Very disturbing news out of Utah.
Yeah, very much.
A second case that we've followed very closely, and our friends Lance and Tim and their Missing podcast have covered this case extensively. That is the disappearance of Maura Murray, who's been gone now from New Hampshire and the University of Massachusetts, my alma mater, where she disappeared more than 17 years ago. There may be a development in that case in that bones have been found, human remains have been found at Loon Mountain, New Hampshire, which is about 25 miles away from Haverhill, New Hampshire, where her car was found. In the early going of the investigation of the Maura Murray disappearance, there were three young college-age men who were on the suspect list, who I think were skiing and working at Loon Mountain. She disappeared in February 2004, so this is during ski season. Her car is found after a relatively minor accident on a snowy road, essentially abandoned. She's never found. One of the groups of people that they looked into were these three guys that were working up at Loon Mountain, and not trying to tie those two threads together prematurely, but it did make me think back to discussions of these three suspects, persons of interest, in the Maura Murray disappearance, and the fact that now bones have been found at a construction site at Loon Mountain.
There's been so many twists and turns in this Maura Murray case over the years. I think it'll be very interesting to see if it is finally time for some answers and resolution here. So we'll definitely look forward to that. It should take a while, I would assume, to get test results back. So I think we won't know for many months. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes of this development.
I know that New Hampshire State Police are taking the lead here, and some of the articles I read indicated that a number of the top agencies in New Hampshire were going to be involved in the analysis of these bone fragments. And I think we're looking at least 2 to 3 months before we have some results. And Julie Murray, Maura's sister, who's been a family spokesperson and advocate in that case, was talking with the Boston television stations and radio stations and so on about how difficult this is. It's the first solid lead I think they've had in the Maura Murray case in several years, I would say.
We'll look forward to seeing what sort of answers eventually come out of all of this. We're going to get back to our analysis of All That Remains by Patricia Cornwell, the novel that may or may not be based on the Colonial Parkway Murders, depending on who you ask and perhaps what day of the week it is. So you're grinning over there. I can see it.
Is this the part when I snort derisively? Because if this book isn't the Colonial Parkway Murders, I'll eat my hat.
It is interesting, though, that we've had some people comment on our first episode. Thank you very much for all your comments, by the way. We always appreciate them. And I think we do need to make clear that Patricia Cornwell has never said one way or the other that this is or is not based off the Colonial Parkway Murders. I don't think she has ever actually come out and spoken about it. So I don't want people to think that she flat out said, oh, no, this isn't based on that case, when we're looking at this and going, actually, probably it is. Oh. We don't want you to think that she said that. She didn't. She's never come out and said it hasn't been based on the case.
Your probably is my, you've got to be kidding. This fictional book, I'm putting air quotes around that, know. Is clearly based on the Colonial Parkway Murders.
I know. I'm hedging so that our legal department has something to eventually wrangle with when she sends her high-powered lawyers after us.
Let's not plant that thought.
Yeah, let's not at all.
Just keep going. Tell us more, Kristin Dilley.
The last time that we left off in our discussion of the book, we were talking about the fact that there are two characters that are very similar to your sister, Kathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. And those are the two characters, Jill Harrington and Elizabeth Mott. And we did cover last time that there are quite a few similarities between the fictional counterparts and I almost said exactly what you said earlier off air. I almost said real life characters.
But we're not real characters, are we?
We're not real characters. There are a lot of similarities between Kathy and Becky and their fictional counterparts, Jill and Elizabeth. And one thing I wanted to touch on and get your clarification on, Bill, because you are the expert on Kathy Thomas. Jill is described in the novel as being a special and accomplished woman, which of course we know would describe both Kathy and Becky. But she is also described as being very conflicted about her sexuality. And to the best of my knowledge, that did not apply to either Kathy or Becky. Can you speak to Kathy for a minute?
Yeah, I don't think any of us ever had the sense that Kathy was conflicted about being a lesbian. Now, remember, my younger brother Jack was also gay, and Kathy were extremely close. They're 1 year and 2 weeks apart. They're the youngest of 4 kids. And we used to talk about the big kids, which would be my older brother Richard and myself. I'm 3 years younger. And then the little kids. Now, Jack's only 1.5 years behind me, but the world got divided up into the big kids and the little kids. Interestingly, as we grew up and became teenagers and started dating, Kathy and Jack were always extremely close, and and they were confidants from as far back as I can remember. I don't think I remember at any point when Kathy came out to us as being lesbian, I don't think there was ever any conflict inside Kathy's heart and mind. Any conflict that I'm aware of, those were external forces.
Right.
The fact that she was gay at a time when you couldn't be gay or lesbian and serve in the United States Navy. Her conflicts would have been with the Navy, with the NCIS, who investigated her, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, who looked into her sexuality in 1984 and directly led to her making the decision to leave the Navy. Those were all external forces. With Becky, I think we know less because Kathy was involved with a shipmate. She met and fell in love with a shipmate, and they lived together. It's got to be about 4 years. And then they broke up directly as a result of the NCIS investigation into Kathy's sexuality. Her girlfriend was out of the Navy and therefore in the clear by that point. So her girlfriend then introduced her to a classmate, Rebecca Dowski, and Kathy entered into a dating relationship with Rebecca Dowski in the spring of 1986. Getting down to the math here, Becky is Kathy's second lesbian relationship. For Becky, Kathy is her first relationship with a woman. We're not aware of any conflict that Becky might have been feeling about it. The two women, Kathy and Becky, were very happy and really seemed to be developing a very nice relationship that was probably stretching on for about 6 months at the time of their death. I'm not sure what would have happened after Becky had graduated from William and Mary the following year, but certainly at that moment, things seemed very good and very happy because Becky wasn't out to her family about being in a lesbian relationship. I don't know if too many people can attest to Becky's state of mind. Very hard for me to say definitively that Becky didn't have any conflicted feelings about being in a gay relationship.
And that's great. That's a better response than I would have expected. There is discussion in this chapter, too, which I also think is worth going over, that maybe the two women, Jill and Elizabeth, had been having a discussion of such impassioned moment that they wouldn't have noticed someone coming up to them in the parking lot and trying to abduct them. And I feel like Cornwell puts the two of them at a rather rundown sort of bar called the Anchor Bar and Grill. We do have eyewitness testimony that potentially puts Kathy and Becky at the Yorktown pub on October of 1986. So I feel like there is some merit to the theory that maybe Kathy and Becky were followed from the parking lot of the Yorktown pub onto the Parkway, but I feel like that's also, there's only merit to that theory if we can prove that they were there, and we can't really prove that they were there.
The FBI did look hard at that idea that two women were seen at the Yorktown pub, and I remember they were looking for a particular waitress who had supposedly waited on them. I don't think they were ever able to find that waitress or confirm, did you wait on these two women at the pub that evening? It is possible that if Kathy and Becky went to a secluded spot along the Colonial Parkway, that they could have been so involved in conversation or making out or whatever that they might not have paid attention to their surroundings sufficiently so that someone could have followed them and crept up to the car. That doesn't seem to be a stretch to me.
We did also hear some speculation at one point that they may have been at Nick's Seafood Pavilion and not the Yorktown pub. But again, I don't think we've ever found any solid evidence that they were there either.
The one thing that might make me push back a little bit against the Nick's theory is that I guess you could get a hamburger at Nick's. The autopsy results showed hamburger, ground beef, lettuce, those things in their systems. So that kind of steers you towards burgers.
Or tacos
or something like that. And as we've talked about, Williamsburg 30 years ago is a very different place. Your late night dining options are pretty limited. So
yes.
You've got burgers like McDonald's or a place like Taco Bell.
Yep.
Or you might have the Yorktown pub. But it's not a long list of places that you could go. And then, of course, what you're looking for is a place that would have served ground beef. The Yorktown pub is definitely on that list.
There are also a series of delis in Williamsburg near the William and Mary campus that they could have gone to. But I feel like if you're headed out to the Parkway and that's your end goal, probably the Yorktown pub is a better bet.
The other thing is that I've often wondered if two women, gay women, would two lesbians go to the Yorktown pub? What we've been told, and again, a lot of people are looking at the Yorktown pub in 2021 and trying to offer their perspective, which is valid, but that's not necessarily the same thing as the Yorktown pub now coming up on 35 years ago. People that were around back then have said to me, yeah, they'd probably be fine. It was a kind of a tourist trap during the day and still is.
Yeah.
And had more of a bar scene at night.
Yeah, definitely.
2 women, everybody probably would have been fine. Now, I don't think that Kathy and Becky would have participated in public displays of affection or anything like that. It's a very different world 35 years ago than it is now. I think they would have been very discreet. It's unfortunate that it's never been confirmed that they were there, because I actually think they're pretty distinctive. You've got 2 attractive women in their 20s, one with dark wavy hair to her shoulders and one with long red hair past her shoulders. It's really unfortunate that they were never able to confirm those potential sightings at the Yorktown pub, because that would at least give you a next stop along the trajectory of their evening. They go from William and Mary, leave the campus, go to get something to eat, and then they end up on the Colonial Parkway. And it would be really great to know what the other stops might have been along the way.
And for the remainder of that chapter of the book, there really is not too terribly much else that parallels the actual events of the Colonial Parkway murders. And that goes the same for the following chapter, in which Scarpetta and Marino and Abby Turnbull, the reporter, are just throwing out theories, talking about the killer's MO, trying to figure out essentially what fits. So there's very little in chapters 14 and 15 that have anything to do with the real Colonial Parkway murders. Although in chapter 15, you do start coming toward the end of the book, and Scarpetta and Abby run into the man who does ultimately become the killer. And that is bookstore owner named Stephen Spurrier, who runs a small bookstore called The Dealer's Room, which ties into the playing cards which were left at the crime scenes. So we get a long look into the life and habits of a serial killer. A lot of this, I would love actually to give this fictional killer to one of our profiler friends and say, does this match up with how a real killer would behave?
As we talked about in last week's episode, one of the things that has impressed me about Patricia Cornwell is that she does do a tremendous amount of research, and it's very clear now that she's had this 30-plus year career, she has access to some of the best minds in true crime. So when she offers these theories and ideas that she puts forward in this book and in her other successful novels, they're based on people that she knows, real life experts.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of the fictional characters and storylines that she puts forward, much in the same way in this book, All That Remains, and we're comparing this to a real life case that we're familiar with, I think there's a very good chance that most of her characterization of the Spurrier character, the killer in this particular book, I'll bet these are pretty well grounded in reality. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
She certainly does lay out a litany of characteristics that would check off boxes, I think. He's a loner, never married, underachiever, but who is nonetheless arrogant and aloof, someone who has no success with women and is angry about the fact that he has no success with women. He's described as being voyeuristic and indulging in violent fantasies as well as violent pornography. His house is full of maybe not anything that would directly put him at the crime scene, but his house is described as having no fabrics so that you can't pass on fiber transfer. He has half a dozen nylon warm-up suits, which would also leave few fibers with the tags cut out of them. He's got boxes of surgical shoe covers, decks of playing cards. Like, she does actually lay him out very well, I think. So I got to give her a lot of credit for having put together a pretty creepy guy.
And someone that easily could be based on real life characters and real life serial killers. I think she learns about a lot of these things from the access that she has to experts from all of these fields.
No, exactly. And for every other book of hers that I have read, and I haven't read all of the Scarpetta stuff, I haven't picked up a Scarpetta book since it's been a while. All of her killers are very convincing. All of her research is thorough. She really does a bang up job. I would imagine that if we ran this by one of our profiler friends and said, hey, how many boxes does this check for you? They'd probably go, yeah, it sounds about right.
Funny, even from the hours that we've spent with the profilers that we know, this guy does sound like the kind of individual that often fits a profile of a serial killer.
And it will be very interesting one of these days when there is an arrest in this case, and there will be an arrest in this case.
If not multiple arrests, because I'm now increasingly convinced that not all of the Colonial Parkway murders are directly related.
I think it will be interesting one day when we have arrests or an arrest to see how well the arrestee actually checks off some of the boxes that our profiler friends have put forward to us.
Very interesting point. And that will be hopefully in the near future.
That is something that we look forward to for sure. The final 2 chapters are really a tailspin worthy of television. It would be interesting. I know we've talked before about the fact there always seems to be a Kay Scarpetta film or TV series in the works, but never really actually hitting the airwaves. This is something that I would expect to see in a movie or a TV series, a limited series even. These final 2 chapters, it's a roller coaster.
Cornwell is exercising her creativity as a writer and having some fun. As an author, I think she wants to keep you on the edge of your seat, sure that she keeps you there to the very end. And so the twists and turns, I think, are part of something that she enjoys in terms of laying out the plot for a book like this.
Oh, yeah. And when I do my own writing, the best part is always the big climactic scene at the end where you're typing as fast as you can because you really want to get your characters through the scene. And yeah, it's great stuff. And she does a great job with the final showdown. And even though we've spoiled the vast majority of the book for our readers already, I'm not going to spoil the final full details the final showdown, other than to say that there's a gun battle and a bunch of people die. That's as far as I'm willing to go. Not going to tell you between who and not going to tell you who bites the dust.
I don't know. You're giving away an awful lot.
It is really interesting, though, all these final revelations that come out about the killer. And so how they ultimately catch him and all of that, I will leave for anybody who is not already disgusted by the fact that we have pretty much spoiled this novel.
Does Scarpetta survive?
She's got another 24 books. So,
must have lived.
Yeah.
She's the hero.
She's around for another 24 books. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is a good time to remind that even though there are arrests made in the fictional case, no arrests have ever been made for the Colonial Parkway murders, any of them.
Not one.
Not a single one. Scarpetta does reveal some interesting little fun science facts in there. And again, I don't want to spoil this too terribly much, but let's just say that there's some interesting fun facts about DNA and the fact that it is possible to have 2 different types of DNA in your body. You're looking confused because it's in my notes, but I'm not going to spoil it because I think it's a great little thing for people to read into. But she gives you some fun science facts, let's say.
It's interesting, too, because what year did the book come out again?
92.
So DNA was a thing, but it wasn't really being used in a forensic capacity until the late 80s. So once again, here's Cornwell's intensive research and access to top experts allows her to be writing about DNA, which was relatively new in the early 90s. And yet she's able to write about DNA and the twists she creates around different types of DNA.
Yeah.
At a time when DNA identification and testing was still quite new.
She does some fun, weird science stuff at the end, which of course is explained beautifully by Scarpetta, who is the chief medical examiner. And it all has to do with aplastic anemia and blood transfusions and bone marrow from family members changing your DNA and all of that. I can't remember the full 100% details the way that she described it, but it's pretty cool science. So anybody who's interested in cool science, check out that final chapter.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And then we do end up with Cornwell leaving the story on just a little bit of a mystery by sharing that there is a possible Camp Perry connection to Stephen Spurrier after all. So yes, you get just
seeing
a
as how
little...
she laid down those breadcrumbs earlier in the book.
Yes, you do get a nice little hint that maybe there is a darker conspiracy afoot with regard to Camp Perry. I don't know. I don't buy it necessarily.
As I said last week, I actually think that the author is the origin of that Camp Perry story, so, which we've been hearing about for years. People are insisting to us.
Yes.
It's a rogue agent from Camp Perry group who's come out. They've gone over the edge and they're testing out their assassination techniques on the innocent citizens of Virginia.
I think that is she is wholly responsible for that one. And it's a fun theory, although I guess if you take it seriously, it's not so fun. But it's very unlikely that's actually taking place.
I will admit that I found some of our discussion last week very interesting in that the idea that trainees from Camp Perry would go out and try their techniques of surveillance, tracking people, following people, surreptitious photography and recording and so on, that they'd go out and mix it up and go to Colonial Williamsburg and downtown Williamsburg and the shopping centers in the area and that sort of thing. Almost like homework, practice these techniques. I'm sure, as we talked about last week, the citizenry wouldn't be thrilled about that. But did I think that was an interesting idea? I'll admit that as someone that enjoys a good story as much as the next person, I thought that was intriguing.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd want to be that person who was being followed and listened to and shadowed. But at the same time, get that is an interesting possibility.
Yeah.
They'd go out on field trips.
Yeah, so we're gonna leave and go do some other stuff for a little bit. We're gonna go off base and have a field trip. I do the idea that I live pretty close to Camp Perry. It's one of those things that I'm not gonna let it keep me up at night, but every once in a while it crosses my mind. I wonder what they're doing behind that fence.
Or I wonder what they're doing following me down the road.
Yeah, the thought has crossed my mind a number of times.
The place where I think we get to a real stretch is then thinking that trainees at Camp Perry are going to go out and kill innocent people who have done nothing wrong. That part, I think, okay, now we're well into the realm of fiction. Yeah, for sure. All that remains, it's not the only fictional work about the Colonial Parkway murders, but it is the only one that has actually been strongly contested by the family of the victims as being too close to the facts of the case. So in 1997, the Phelps family did take Patricia Cornwell to court. I was doing some reading on various news articles about the lawsuit, and an article from the AP said, according to Mrs. Phelps, this is not fiction. Cornwell should not be making money from someone else's misery, which I can wholly get behind. And Bill, I'll get you to weigh in on that as well. I completely understand where they're coming from. It's very frustrating to feel that your loved one's real life story and tragic ending is being used in such a thinly disguised way. The Phelps family was extremely unhappy about the book and remains so. They brought it up with me several years ago. As you mentioned, there are other fictional books. There's a book called 23 Miles that came out in 2015 by Renee Mackenzie, which is a work of lesbian fiction, which is a specialty. And at the same time, Renee based the book on the Colonial Parkway murders, specifically that of Kathy and Becky's. But she also contacted me and told me what she was doing and asked me if she could ask a bunch of questions. She was a bartender at the Hershey Bar, which was a very popular lesbian bar in Norfolk, which actually ties in directly to Kathy and Becky's murder. There's a possibility that the Hershey Bar may have played a small role in Kathy being investigated by the NCIS. So when Renee McKenzie contacted me, it was a very friendly inquiry, and she wasn't just going to write a book without learning more about Kathy and Becky. She knew who they were and had met them and probably had served drinks to them at the Hershey Bar. Her approach was very respectful, and I'm sure if I had objected to her writing the book, she wouldn't, or basing the book on Kathy and Becky's murder, she would not have moved forward. In that example, I think there was a significant effort made to make sure that Kathy's family was okay with it, and we were.
And just to be clear, so that we are very clear, Patricia Cornwell has never contacted your family or any of the families that you're aware of, correct?
That's correct. While you and I were going through this analysis of all that remains, in revisiting these details, and you did some outstanding research, and thank you for that. You reminded me just how closely the Jill Harrington and Elizabeth Mott characters also parallel Kathy and Becky. I understand the frustration that the Phelps family and the Lowers, although I have not spoken with the Lowers about this particular issue, that they may have felt. I completely get it. They felt violated. They were also suspicious, and they said so in their court filings. They felt that it was possible that Cornwell had used her job at the Commonwealth of Virginia Medical Examiner's Office to make unauthorized use of the contents of what should be confidential medical files regarding their deaths.
Let me make sure that I actually quote from that directly so that I can make sure that we're clear on this. So this is again from the AP Associated Press piece. The lawsuit contends that when Cornwell worked in the medical examiner's office, she obtained autopsy details that were never made public because the case is unsolved and was never prosecuted. According to the lawsuit, the autopsy report stated that Ms. Phelps' eyeballs were missing and 2 front teeth were knocked out and found next to her body. The 2 bodies were found positioned arm in arm, face down. The couple contends those are among the details contained in Cornwell's book.
I can't say definitively what was in their autopsy report because I've never seen it, but that does appear to be the kind of level of detail that was not made public. And I think this is what set the Phelps family off. And as we talked about last week as well, the whole thing with the examination of the bones by the Smithsonian Institute, all of those things were so directly, precisely duplicated in what is supposed to be a fictional book. And the description of the crime scene and all of those details were so spot on. There's no way it's a coincidence. So I understand the Phelps family's frustrations. Ultimately, they were not able to prevail in their court proceedings, partly because it's very difficult to prove access.
Yeah.
But as we took a look at the book very carefully over these past couple of weeks, I was struck by how many parallels you found, Kristin. There were a lot.
There were, I know. And interestingly, though, I did want to note that, here's where things do get a little murky. There are no missing eyeballs and missing front teeth in the book. Like, that is not a thing that is mentioned. It does say that Deborah Harvey is missing teeth, but it is not her front ones, and they were not found next to the body. And there's never any mention of eyeballs. So this is the part where it's like, who got the details wrong? Did the reporter get the details wrong? Did Cornwell who got the details wrong here? But there are definitely some things that were contended in the court filing that do not appear in the book, things that appear in the book that don't appear in the court filing. It's murky.
As you say, though, and I'm not taking a shot at the reporter or the Associated Press, we're not looking at the court filings themselves.
That's
We're
true.
looking at a quote from Jewel Phelps, Mrs. Phelps, the mom, whom I know, to the AP, as you said, it gets a little murky.
And the Washington Post did do an article about not only this lawsuit, but about in 1997, there were two other authors who had lawsuits filed against them for very similar reasons. Janet Dilley, who is a romance writer, was one of them, and Joe Klein, who wrote Primary Colors, which everybody remembers as being a pretty thinly veiled knock at Bill Clinton.
You think?
And both of them had lawsuits filed against them. And so the Post did do an article about that called Crimes of Passion. And it did have this to say: the accusations against Ms. Cornwell are murkier. There is no legal basis, at least in America, for the notion that people own the rights to events that have happened to them, or that they can sue to control the imaginative use of such events in fiction. The exception is cases where a real person is clearly recognizable. So then I guess the question becomes, are Anna Maria and Daniel so clearly recognizable in this that you would have a case?
There's a lot of things that center around the right to publicity, but most of those things also are built around public figures.
Yeah.
So if you wrote about somebody who was a 50s rock star with dark hair slicked back who sang about the blue moon of Kentucky, people might expect that you're actually referring to Elvis Presley in that example. Because Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer were not public figures, and most people wouldn't know what a fictionalized version of their lives, or in this case, their tragic death, would constitute. I understand that the creative world, authors, etc., scriptwriters, and so on, could easily slide on whether or not, if the standard is, would the average person recognize them, they might be able to get away under that standard. As we talked about with the Jill Harrington and Elizabeth Mott characters in the book, I challenged you a couple of times and said, oh, come on, they've barely changed the detail. This is Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, without a doubt. William and Mary and the whole nine yards. Jill Harrington was a top salesperson for a
computer company, whereas my sister had left the Navy and become a top salesperson for a stock brokerage. Okay, a few details are changed, but it's pretty close. And I think in total, when you look at the entire story of the Colonial Parkway murders, particularly what was known in 1992 or so when Cornwell would have been writing the book, I think where Cornwell starts to push the envelope is a lot of things that Cornwell was writing about had not been made public. A lot of this stuff that has come out, partly because of this podcast, the television series, the many television, radio, and podcast interviews that I've done and other family members have done, more details have come out about the Colonial Parkway murders in the 30 years since. Back then, in the early 90s, when Cornwell was writing and researching this book, I think there's a tremendous amount of detail that she includes in her fictionalized version, calling it All That Remains, that had not been made public at that point. And that's probably an area of some vulnerability. And certainly, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, she's never publicly stated it's not the Colonial Parkway murders. And I've even said once or twice in previous episodes of this podcast, I defy her to do that because I would publicly challenge her on that. I think she's way too savvy to get caught up in saying something like that. I think she's rather just quietly go on about her business of being a successful author and not engaging in debate about whether or not this particular book is based on this particular case. But in my mind, there's no question. So that's Bill Thomas's final thoughts on the matter. And here are mine, essentially. I'm still, at the end of this, I'm still very conflicted about this book. I came to it at a super young age, like 11 or 12, because I was interested in the Colonial Parkway murders case. It did not give me correct information about the case that I knew at that point, but it did spark my interest in it, which continued at a low flame in the back of my fevered, crime-ridden brain. until I reached out to you in 2016, I think it was. Wow, it's been a while.
It has.
And wanted to start doing some work on this case. I can't bring myself for that reason to wholly dislike the book, because actually it's because of the book that I'm here. And I wouldn't trade, I'll be sentimental for a minute. I would not trade my relationship with you or any of the other family members for anything. This has been an incredible, amazing, moving, emotional journey, and I would not give that up for anything.
So we have to give Patricia Cornwell some credit for that?
I got to give her some credit for that. And so I can't bring myself to dislike this book. She's a great writer. She's a great researcher. I've enjoyed almost everything else she's written. She did some crappy stuff with one of her characters that I did not approve of, but that's just me. Do I see that there are issues with the book, knowing what I do now about the crime scenes and the pain that it causes those families, particularly the Phelps and the Lowers? I see those issues. Do I think she included details that are strikingly similar to the crime scenes in the book on purpose? Yeah, I do. But as you said, you can't prove or disprove intent. So we're never going to know what she was thinking or doing at that point. And you can't prove or disprove access. So we're not going to know how much she did or didn't have. So do I see that there are issues? Yeah. Do I still like the book? Kinda. I feel bad saying that, but like less now than I did, but I still do like the book. And am I still a fan? I haven't read anything of hers in a really long time, so I don't know. Maybe I'll pick up Autopsy when it comes out. It's supposed to be pretty interesting. How do I feel about this book? Meh. Meh. That's where I'm at. Maybe. I don't know. I sort of like it, but there's issues with it. But do I still kind of like it? Yeah, I guess. That's about as murky a response as I can come up with. But it is so troublesome trying to deal with the feelings about this book. It's very cut and dried for you. And it always has been. In fact, one of the first things that I asked you about when we started talking was, how did you feel about the book? And you, of course, you snorted derisively and you were like, oh, it was worth 75 cents, which is what I paid for it. But I still have real trouble with this book and what it presents to me, both as a book lover and now as somebody who's very invested with this case. So I don't know. It's difficult.
And as always, I remind you, this book is available at your public library.
Yes, it is. It is.
So feel free to borrow it, but you don't have to buy it.
And feel free, of course, at any point to give us your thoughts, your insights, your arguments, anything with regard to our series of episodes on All That Remains, because we would love to hear from all of you what you think about this book.
And next week, we get back into the Colonial Parkway Murders and further exploration of true crime.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.